there are few things that I think dig into the root of emotional upheaval as pricing, especially raising your prices.
Business is messy and unpredictable.
Sometimes lonely.
So lonely.
So lonely.
And inspiration can often come from really weird places.
We pick up where the bullet point blogs and the highlight reels leave off.
We start with the stories.
Welcome back to So Here's My Story. I'm Jody.
I'm Elliot.
And in just a minute, we're going to hear Elliot tell a story that we end up getting into talking about the whole thorny patch of worth and value and pricing and time and all the nuts and bolts, heart, brain, mind, science nonsense of that.
But
it's
first,
a snarly patch.
It is a snarly patch. But first, I just want to welcome Joey Byrne, who is the newest member of our Facebook group. So welcome, Joey. We can't wait to hear more from you. And if you'd like to see how to join the group or pick up our episode that made our intern blush, you can go to sohere'smystory.com, and that's where we have all the quick buttons to everything. The quick buttons to everything. I'm not sure what kind of promise that is, but maybe not everything. Not everything.
But all the So Here's My
Story
Story things. A lot of stuff.
You ready?
Yep.
So here's my story. Actually, it's kind of a half story. I'm going to tell a half story about this matter that came into my office. I'm going to
tell you a joke, but I'm only going to tell you the punchline.
Just the punchline. You don't need the setup. That's exactly right.
But to be fair, this is a thing that we struggle with sometimes because there's a story you want to tell, but you don't want to tell someone else's story.
Exactly.
So, right. So you can pick out the salient parts.
So this arises out of something that I'm handling for a client, but all the exposition doesn't really matter. What matters is the key misunderstanding between my client and the person on the other side. It was embodied in this claim. The person on the other side is saying, "You owe me a ton of money." And I said, responding to the lawyer, "Why? What's the basis of the claim?" And it boiled down to the lawyer saying, "Well, my guy spent all of this time. He went to this meeting and he did this phone call and he went back to this meeting and he sent these emails and we have a binder full of emails that was sent." And I said, "Okay, let's assume that's true. Your guy spent a lot of time," and I get he's frustrated. "But what was the value? Your claim is based on value because they didn't have an agreement where you're compensated for time like a lawyer's billable hour. Right. So what was the value? Where does your guy think that his contribution of something had a dollar value for which my client is not liable?" And that's where we have a complete disconnect. Because each time I say that, the other side gets more and more indignant saying, "Are you saying," and this was one of our conversations, "are you saying that my client fraudulently compiled these timesheets?" So they just keep
coming at you, "But the time."
But the time. And I said,
"Oh my goodness.
No, I'm not even addressing the timesheets. Let's assume your client put in 1 billion hours.
Right. 10 billion.
10 billion hours. Let's assume that is gospel truth."
Yeah. And they just can't hear
I
you.
believe that it's a question of value. So what's the value? If I have, and this is where it went slightly off the rails in our last conversation, I said, if my dog attended meetings,
oh, Elliot,
he would be spending time in the conference room, but I think you'd agree he was not due compensation.
Oh, man. Oh, yeah, that sounds like that was helpful.
That was,
did that go just the way you'd hoped?
It went exactly how I mapped it out in my head. It sounded great, and yeah, it didn't get us anywhere. But the point is that even before the emotional support dog facet of the conversation, even before that, it was fascinating to me that there was just this disconnect.
Right.
Because especially coming from my profession, where so often time equals money in a mathematical
and usually
sense.
A lot of money.
And there's a lot of money, and there are invoices to support that proposition. But
did that make you question your existence? But just kidding.
Not this. That ship is long sailed. But trying to impress upon somebody that just because they invest what is admittedly a very precious asset, which is their time, does not equate to value.
Right.
And that's the bridge that I was trying to cross.
Yeah. So a couple things there. I mean, there's a whole piece to this that we could go into that I don't want to. So let's not, which is some things I actually learned a lot from you over the years of the importance of aligning expectations long in advance. All of this could have been avoided with
absolutely.
some clarity of what are we doing and how much time should I be putting in. The mismatch of expectation is at the root core of all of this, but I don't want to go there. There's also this time and value. So I do want to play around in that, but it's funny because it does remind me a little bit of, because there's another layer to that of when my son was tiny, he was probably like 3 and we were walking to the park, maybe 4, like 3 or 4. We're walking to the park and this person is walking towards us and this person is very heavy set. And my son, being 3, like opens his mouth and says something about like, look, mommy, that lady's really fat or something like that. Like the skin like peels off your body. And I knelt down to him because, it's not malice. It's not meanness.
It's observation.
It's observation. And, that's your job. You have to teach kids. So I leaned down to him and I was explaining, I said, honey, we don't, that's not nice. And it reminds me so much of this conversation because all he could go back to and all he could hear in that moment, and I couldn't actually move the conversation forward. He kept going, but mommy, with this panicked look on his face, I'm not lying. I'm not lying. And I said, I know what I wanted to say is like, I know, honey, that's actually the problem.
It's like, damn.
Yeah, but it's hurtful, which is then of course becomes this complicated conversation of the truth and hurtful. It's not like I'm not asking you to lie, just aware that you're, anyway, whatever. I don't want to go down that rabbit hole, but it is this funny thing when I'm debating which rabbit hole I want to take this into, the complication of when you and another person are trying to have a conversation from 2 completely different boats. And, you're sailing this way with, but the time, but I'm not lying, they are. Mm-hmm. And you're sailing, no, that's actually not what I'm talking about. We're talking about this. So just, you can feel how if that conversation is going to go anywhere, you first have to be even willing to be talking about the same things. I mean, talk about apples and oranges. You're like apples and like rocks. Like they're not even both food.
That's right, because we're each making a choice as to what is the determinative value or facet of that relationship. And I'm choosing value, substantive value, but not in a money context, but really in a moving forward or contribution, et cetera, context. And he's choosing time. And depending upon the context you're in, neither one is necessarily wrong objectively.
Sure. And you do have to, and I think it gets even more complicated than that, because I do want to spend some time on this, spend time, haha. Well, actually, isn't that fascinating? You literally use the verb spend and time.
Yes.
They go, we acknowledge it in our language that there is value to time. And yet, I heard a very compelling argument one time, actually from a lawyer who was debating the whole like dollars for hours model for law in general. He was like, look, if I can solve your problem in 5 minutes, shouldn't you actually pay me even more than if it took me like 10 years to solve your problem?
I won't get on that soapbox, but you know where I stand on that. That's exactly correct.
Right. So there is something like, if I can solve your problem quickly, I should actually be valued even more. And in the same breath, I will acknowledge that you have to tie things back to time because it is the thing that you're investing in a lot of cases. So it's not that the guy is wrong, but he's not exactly right either. So how do you sort of think about to untangle his argument that time equals dollars, I think is misleading. I had an employee when we were at the architecture firm who did the same thing, wanted to argue all of his overtime hours. And when we really did pay attention to people's, like how much time they were spending and whatnot. It was important. We didn't want people, being overworked and whatnot. That was a strong value of the firm. And yet this was somebody who, at the end of the day, it was a tough conversation because like, yeah, but that really should have taken you like 4 hours. Like it shouldn't have taken you 15 hours to get that done. It was a 4-hour job. So it's a tricky place.
It is. And I've had 2 conversations. One was personal. The other was a jury trial argument. The jury trial argument, which is not an original from me, I didn't give it. I read it, but the person was talking about this exact situation. He says, you know how many hours it takes to put together, to construct a working iPad? And especially if you take the research and development time and bridge it over. But if you were charging by the hour, each iPad would cost you $10,000. So nobody would do it. So they have to price it according to the value to the buyer as opposed to the time. But the other thing, which is a much more personal issue, is when I probably had been a lawyer for 6 or 7 years. I was working with this firm in Towson. And they came to me and they said, we had a meeting, the partners had a meeting, and because of your contributions in terms of clients and the work that you do, et cetera, we'd like to invite you to be a partner in the firm, but that invitation would open up, or whatever they said, next year. It would be in a year. We wanted to let you know you're on a partnership track with us, but we would invite you next year to become a partner. And I was really upset. This conversation did not go how they wanted, because I felt that I had qualified for a partner right then. And what I had said to them is, help me understand why the turning of 365 calendar pages better qualifies me to be a partner.
Right. Well, did it even have anything to do with you, or was that more their path?
I think it really had to do with their path, and that I was young, and I was considerably younger than they were. And I had been with the firm then for 4 years, but maybe they felt 5 was a magic number.
Who knows? I mean, did they give you any kind of insight on that? They didn't,
because the conversation devolved to the point where they were really angry at me for not feeling honored, and I was really angry at them because I felt that my contributions to this date were disrespected, and it centered around age and time.
Right.
For them, my perception was
basically what they're saying is like, I want to marry you. I want to spend my life with you, but not till next year.
Right, not till next year.
I'm going to propose next year.
And I wanted clarification. Yeah. If you told me that I hadn't hit a goal, if you told me that I hadn't, in other words, I wanted it value-based and they wanted it time-based, and there was a huge disconnect over that.
It's funny. This is why I brought up the expectation thing. And I don't think you can get away from the fact that this topic is a problem almost exclusively when it comes down to mismatched expectations. That some things are very clearly time for dollars. But what's interesting, especially when I was starting my business, and for many, many, many years thereafter, I always struggled with pricing. I mean, everybody struggles with pricing, especially if what you sell is you. I've always imagined I would struggle less with pricing if I sold copiers, or maybe not. But it's a thing.
It's a thing, right? And copiers, even with their different features, are a commodity. You can look left, look right, see what other copies are, but
so it just is what it is. So,
you're you, right?
So you're literally putting value on like, what will Jody Hume bring to the conversation?
Correct.
And so it's hard to not let it be personal. But a few years ago, I found some like pretty solid sea legs with that, and I know how I price things, and I still struggle with it sometimes, but it's mostly okay. Until a few weeks ago, somebody asked me to comment. I don't do much of any training at all, but it was they wanted some training on a topic that I do, like tough conversations, which is something that I feel very passionate about. Right. And so I was like, I would love to do that, except that they wanted me to do it an hour. Like an hour-long thing. And when I have done trainings and things, they're either like a full day or a half day. And so I just use my facilitation rates, whether or not that's the right way to do it. It feels good to me. They're happy with it. We're good. So that's always been fine. But it was so funny to feel what a snarl I got into over it being an hour, because frankly, it would be prep-wise, it wouldn't be that much different from me doing a half day kind of thing. I tried to think of it like, well, if I just took 1/8 of my day rate or 1/4 of my half day rate, then it was this tiny that I'm like, well, that doesn't seem right. No. But then when I put it where it felt right for me, that I'm like, I kept going back to there, like, but it's just an hour. Now it's an hour for 12 of their highest people, they're 12 key managers. So then I tried to think of it that way, but I kept getting stuck on, but it's just an hour. Like, are they going to say that's for an hour of her time? And it was so funny because it's been a while since I've felt that snarl, but oh my goodness, it was like a wormhole I got sucked into.
And I found myself in that 2 weeks ago because we were asked to do something last minute, and I won't get into all of what it was, but I called the client and I said, look, we can do this. The cost is $5,000. It's a flat fee. It's $5,000. And so he said to me, well, wait a minute. I thought this was just going to take you 3-4 hours at most. I said, that's probably true, but it's not just 3-4 hours. It's 3 or 4 of my hours. I mean, you can go find somebody else, but you know what I can do, and you know I can meet your deadline, and you know I'll get this done for you. But that's the fee.
And you have to put off other...
Exactly. Right, you have to put off other... You have to let them butt ahead in line.
There are ripple effects to that.
And I explained that, and I didn't want to sound like really arrogant and egotistical, like, well, I'm the best in the world. And so, but I also didn't want to disrespect my own value, because I've gotten to the point in my career where I want to make sure that I don't sell myself short and say, well, geez, I know it's just that. No, this is it. And I totally get it. I'm certainly fine if you want to just compare on price and go somewhere else because there are other people that are cheaper.
So here's an interesting place we can take this. I had a conversation with a friend who is raising their prices, and as they should, because it's been a while since they've raised them. And it's interesting because it brought up this whole line of thinking for me of something that I've noticed. Because while we were talking about time and value, I think just the whole value conversation in general can be such a touchy one. And I was reminded of this thing that I hadn't thought about in a while where, I think when you're first starting or you're first doing something and not when you're first starting, but when you were first starting with a new prospect or a client, it is absolutely tricky or dodgy it can be confronting to like put your pricing out there. But if they say, no thanks, whatever, you can be like, well, they're lost. They don't recognize my value. So be it. Still is awkward and painful and can be confronting and make, dredge up insecurities about your value sometimes, unless you're feeling really solid about it, whatever. But there is something especially exponentially emotionally tricky about raising your prices. There is far more than in that first initial thing. Because it's almost like, you can go up to somebody in a bar and ask them out. And if they say no, it's like, oh, well. But if you're asking something of somebody who's already with you, because if somebody's already working with me and I say, well, starting in 2019, these are going to be my prices. And they say, oof, yeah, no, that's, can't do it. They are literally, there's no other way to take that than them saying, yeah, I know full well what you can do, and it's not worth that. Well, and that's that's how it feels, I think.
It does feel that way, but there's also a lot of baggage.
Because in the first part, you can say, well, they don't know what they're missing.
Yes.
But somebody's already working with you. They know what they're missing, and they're choosing to miss it.
But there's also the other difficulty in raising prices is because you're tying the value to something arbitrary. You're tying it because it's no longer December 31st. It's January 1st.
Right.
So you're raising it, number one. Number two, it's not like...
And you can't pretend like the cost of nickel went up on the market.
Yes. It's just the cost of living. It's just 1.7% increase. Right. No, you're just saying, oh, and by the way, I decided that my value is now, wait for it.
Yeah.
Here it is.
Yeah, it is. It's a conversation that has come up over and over. I was at lunch yesterday with someone, and he was saying, he's like, I haven't raised my prices in 5 years, and I really need to. He's like, and so here, let's talk about that for a second. So I think one of the ways to raise your prices as you need to is to not wait 5 years, but to know. Some of the best advice I ever got was like, whenever your practice is full, raise your rates. That you don't have to raise your rates arbitrarily. It's just that for anybody new coming in, you've now upgraded, and you don't necessarily have to go back and raise rates for the current people. So that can work unless you have people who work with you for years and years and years and years and years and years, and then that doesn't work as well. But for people who work with somebody for just a more finite amount of time, I think that can be one way to get around it, is just when your practice is full or when your business is full, raise your rates for new people. But yeah, this guy I was with yesterday does have clients who stick around for basically ever for all intents and purposes. And he just cannot bring himself to raise his prices, and he needs to. And so we're working on it. But it's interesting how there are few things that I think dig into the root of emotional upheaval as pricing, especially raising your prices.
And I'll tell you, here's an example of something that I know is right, like not a good way to do it. And this is how I handle it. And it's been incredibly successful for me. It's been a relief for me, and it's probably the worst way to do it. So Perfect. It took me a long time to raise rates. I would go 3 years, whatever it was. And then I would send out a letter, almost apologetic. dear clients, really sorry about this. What you're about to read may be upsetting. Whatever I would say. But I would say that I'm raising my rates. And I knew...
Don't take this the wrong way.
Don't take this the wrong way. Yeah. And even then I would raise my rates to still being below market value, but not as below market value. And I hated sending those letters. I hated the... if there's a conversation that evolved from it, I hated even listening to the phone ring after I sent out those emails.
Everyone calling
I assumed
you,
everybody
what's
was
wrong
complaining.
with you?
And then years ago, I decided, you know what? Not sending the letter. As of, the first bill that goes out in the new year, which would be February 1st for the January time, there's going to be higher rates on there.
So you just yanked prices and just didn't let people know?
And I didn't even let them know. I know. Right. Yes.
I'm making my face.
But you know what? And I deserve it. All of the judgmental noises and expressions that from people listening, I get it. I totally get it. And yet,
right.
I've only had, in the years I've been doing this, one conversation. And the conversation was, I didn't really pay attention. Did your rates go up? And I said, yeah, I raised them for the new year. I raised it to this and go, oh, okay, yeah, I thought so. And that was it. I've never had a complaint, and it eliminated angst for me. And so this was a pure example of my saying, oh, on one hand are my clients, on the other hand is me. And I'm going to choose me in that priority system.
I think where I think not to get too specific about this, but I think that where the difference is, or where that can be really dangerous or where it's okay, is if the person who's choosing to buy you sees that pretty clearly from the get, that they have line of sight to it. Whereas where I've seen that kind of decision go really wrong is if that bill goes to some billing department, and it's not till like months and months and months later that person even knows or realizes, and they actually do have an issue with it, but months have gone by and then you're in a contentious kind of thing. So, in my world, it goes right to, well, that's not true. Sometimes it doesn't go right to the person who's making the buying decision. But anyway, it comes back to the expectation thing. But you bring up an important point. Imagine that. Good for you, Elliot. Bravo.
Just for the record, though, I will say I would reverse it if somebody has a problem, number one. And number two, I don't generally do it in mid-project.
Oh, gotcha.
Even though the calendar, I won't raise, unless we're in 3-year, multi-year litigation.
Oh, that makes sense. So just starting in the next year, like the next time they use
project or the next thing.
Oh, that makes a lot more sense. Yeah, perfect. Oh shoot! Now you raise an important point that now I can't remember what your important point was.
See,
never mind.
That's because they're so rare. They're like hidden gems, and unless you seize them when they come by.
Oh, but I don't remember what it was. But it was just that it goes back to that we're tying that there isn't. I think this is the whole point of it. Value, dollars, not value. Dollars really are an arbitrary assignment. They don't actually have their own meaning. And so that is why this is such a challenge. And I could map that metaphorically over to a million places of problems in the world, that dollars are always, without fail, being somewhat arbitrary. I mean, even your iPad example, some of those things cost something, but those things cost is often quite arbitrary. Sometimes it's based on other things, but somewhere down the line, things are being made, giving an assigned value arbitrarily. So I think just even acknowledging that this is a place where, to go right back to your original story, the important thing is not who's right. It's that you, as early as possible, you decide what your agreement is about what something is worth.
No, and that's true. And it gets back to perception. So, and even if you can't do it early in your agreement, yesterday I had a conversation where my client is hoping to sell their company. And they asked me, because they hate negotiating. Mm-hmm. So they asked me to speak with the prospective buyer and reveal the selling price, mm-hmm. To actually have that conversation, which is something that I rarely do. Normally I'm brought in when they kind of have a deal on the material terms and whatever. But I said to the person, this is the basis of the price. And he said, and I liked him right off the bat when he said this, he said, I understand that that's the value to your client, but what we're really talking about is the value to me. And he was right.
Yeah.
It was and he said it very clearly. And he said, so if we're going to have a discussion, I have to tell you what the value is to me. Now, we may or may not have a deal.
Sure.
But we certainly have agreement on that point.
So as we wrap up, I just realized something kind of interesting, cool, corny.
Okay.
So this topic, this exact topic is exactly how we ended up meeting in the first place, you and I.
You're right. That's exactly right.
Because I was at a place where I did not want, this is many, many years ago, and I did not want my practice focused on time because I wanted people to call me anytime they had a problem, and I didn't want it to be an individual buying decision. And I wanted it to be fair to me, but also make it possible for them to use me as little or as much as they needed when they needed. And maybe sometimes that meant, talking to them 10 times in 1 week, but then maybe we didn't talk for 2 months. And I didn't have any models for that. And somebody told me about your empty hourglass program, which does exactly that in terms of law. And then I sort of stalked you and we had our 5 a.m. coffee.
We did. And I will say that this example is the only one in captivity where I've ever been referred to as a model. So that's our story.
But the discussion doesn't have to end here.
No, it does not.
In fact, we don't want it to.
No, we don't.
That is why we actually have our private Facebook group,
which we started to make sure that we could get your comments, your rants, your thoughts,
your stories.
Your stories.
You can find links to that group as well as show notes and links to subscribe via email and how to find us just about anywhere you can possibly find podcasts at sohere'smystory.com.
And you can also find us on Facebook and Twitter at SHMS Podcast.
And since we know it takes a village.
Yes, it does.
We'd like to thank our village, our super talented, incredibly patient team.
And occasionally snarky team.
Yeah, but in the best of ways.
In the best
Lovingly
of ways.
Snarky.
Yes.
Good mockery.
So a huge shout out to the people who actually help us produce our show. First, our sound engineer, Tom Hansen.
Thanks to Christy Schmier for our brilliant show notes and all the other fantastic writing she does for us.
And to Taylor Mathauer for doing just a little bit of everything.
Including wrangling us.
Which is no small feat.
No, it's not.
This is Jody Hume.
And I'm Elliot Wagenheim.
And you've been listening to So Here's My Story.